Hello, this is News for Scotland. Thanks for joining me. This episode's from the 29th of March 24. I'm Hugh Stewart. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll bring you our selection of top stories for a mainly Scottish audience, both here on the European mainland, in the States, and of course in the Shires of England. Thanks for finding us. Coming up later, we're going to look at the Scottish voluntary sector with my colleague Jeanette Hill, who has 2 interviews with volunteers. But that's after our Scottish quick news stories. Let's begin with this week. Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has been FM for 1 year. He took over as the ruling SNP faces its worst crisis with the police investigation into the party's finances and the mysterious resignation of Nicola Sturgeon. Those big setbacks saw the SNP's poll lead over Labour melt away. The two parties are scoring in the mid-30s, with Labour set to make gains from their rivals in the forthcoming UK general election. The First Minister promised that a vote for his party will be a vote for independence, but this week Humza told the reporter that an election victory would simply mean asking Sir Keir Starmer for permission to hold a referendum. Labour's Anas Sarwar says that's not going to happen. Sarwar himself is polling ahead of Yousaf in personal popularity, but that's in relative terms. The truth is that Scottish voters don't much fancy any of their political leaders. With support for independence running ahead of support for the SNP, can the FM close that gap and lead Scotland to independence, or will the SNP settle after a natural party of government within Scotland's devolved administration? Let's move on to Scotland in space. Scotland's place as the UK's primary base for satellite production was confirmed this week with the news that the UK Space Agency plans to open up its first Scottish office in Edinburgh. Glasgow already produces more Earth orbit satellites than anywhere outside of California, and about a fifth of the total UK space workforce is based here in Scotland. Also, our northern latitude makes Scotland a suitable site for vertical launch spaceports. Saxafjord in Shetland, in fact, is the site for Scotland's first rocket liftoff, which is expected in a few months. Coming up in a few minutes, we have 2 stories from our listeners, and this week's topic is volunteering. Jeanette has been talking to Peter and Sarah on helping out in different parts of the voluntary sector. They got in touch with us on Facebook and suggested stories we might like to feature in our shows. Yes, we do. And thanks, Peter and Sarah, for your time. And if you missed it, last week's show has a fascinating piece by listener Angus Lyon on the black Scottish footballer, the first professional player who led Scotland to a 6-1 victory over England. That's in the podcast for the 22nd of March. You can find all our shows easily on Spotify podcasts, or if you bookmark our page on YouTube. And if you do have news for us, please get in touch. The email is info@newsforscotland.org. Or, of course, you can get in touch with us on Facebook, on Twitter X, or leave a comment under the YouTube edition. But just before those 2 guest speakers, here's Jeanette on the voluntary sector.
Hi folks, Jeanette Hill here, and we're looking forward to a little report on the voluntary sector in Scotland. So you might have heard it as the voluntary sector or the third sector, or people still sometimes refer to it as charities. Although we call it the voluntary sector, we actually have lots of people employed, paid employment in that sector in Scotland. And it contributes greatly to a wide variety of different areas, whether it's in wildlife concerns, environmental concerns, or whether it's health and social care, helping out with children's community groups, a whole range of different things. Perhaps the move after Thatcherism of the early 1980s, the move away from council-led, council-paid-for jobs in youth and community, in other care work, etc., moving over to either the private industry or indeed the third sector. Perhaps this movement led to the wide expansion of this area, this sector that we have now. So I've been asking our listeners to talk about their experiences in the voluntary sector, what they feel they get from it, what they feel their community gets from it, and if there's any issues they worry about in that sector, such as maybe a charity that provides a service has some jobs going and then it runs out of funding and has to shut down, or indeed conditions perhaps for the workers in certain areas, maybe because they feel the charity's under-resourced or whatever, they feel they can't fight for better pay and conditions. Certainly the voluntary sector has experienced, like all other sectors, has experienced a significant increase in their costs recently, and they are struggling to keep these costs paid for, because they're struggling also at the same time with having their finances reduced. So those two sides are making it really difficult for them to continue to make that service provision. Of course, they're not legally obliged. That's one of the definitions of the third sector, is that they're not legally obliged to provide the service, whatever it happens to be, whether it's for your adult with learning disability, helping them out certain days a week or whatever. They are not legally obliged to provide that service, unlike, say, social services, etc., who may well have a legal duty to provide that service. The charity isn't. So they may break down or decide that they can't give the services that they had previously because of financial restrictions. So what does this mean for the sector and for the people that are getting the services provided by them? So some of our readers, listeners, I suppose you're listeners, aren't you, have already very kindly give their ideas on the voluntary sector and their own experiences, and some more will give those experiences in just a few minutes. They're going to be interviewed by me, hopefully, and tell us more about the different experiences. So John Opera wrote on our Facebook page that he retired from the prison service at 55. He felt he was still fit and healthy. He didn't want to play golf, but he wanted something to help fill his time, preferably part-time. And he saw an advert online asking for suitable people to volunteer for victim support, supporting witnesses in the court system in his hometown in Livingston. And it's immediately sparked his interest, as so he applied, because he felt he could use the knowledge that he had previously gained in his job in the prison service. So he did. He attended the interview. He was successful. He worked there once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week for at least 10 years, and he thoroughly enjoyed his time there. He felt that he was using his knowledge effectively to help people going through this difficult time, and advised and prepared witnesses to give evidence in a court setting and helped alleviate people's anxiety in that. A lovely, worthwhile job done there, John. Thank you for that, and I'm sure your community were grateful for you contributing that with your knowledge and skills. So later we're going to hear from 2 different people who have got some different experiences in the voluntary sector. And if you've got any, please put your comments below on our YouTube channel, or indeed you can email us at info@newsforscotland.org. Send us a report on your voluntary experience if you want to, for or against, we don't mind, or indeed comment on our Facebook page. Please do. We want to hear about all you people out there doing a fabulous job for your communities right across Scotland. And actually the people that we're interviewing, we've got some from Dumfries and some with Highlands experience as well. Okay, thank you folks. Let's hear very shortly from our other volunteers.
And those interviews are coming up in about 15 minutes or so. Okay, back to the news. Stonewall hits a brick wall. The Scottish Government announced this week its withdrawal from the so-called Diversity Champions scheme run by the controversial charity Stonewall. A Freedom of Information from 2022 showed that the government then paid £3,000 to Stonewall as its fee for being a member of its diversity training scheme. Stonewall was set up in 1989 to campaign for gay rights, but made a turn in 2015 to campaigning for trans rights. Our government now adds to the growing list of public bodies distancing themselves from Stonewall, along with the BBC, Channel 4 and the Equality and Human Rights Commission. OK, next story. Creative Scotland, I Write. You may have heard this week that the I Write Book Festival in Glasgow, which was planning its now annual appearance later this year, announced suddenly that they were going to have to cancel because Creative Scotland had turned down its funding application. Many of Scotland's creative sector immediately took to social media to challenge this decision, and it was also raised in the Scottish Parliament. Here's Annie Wells, Glasgow MSP for the Tories.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I Write Book Festival, which has been running in Glasgow for nearly 20 years, has been cancelled this year just weeks before it was due to return, after its funding bid was rejected by Creative Scotland. And this comes just weeks after it was revealed that the Quango initially awarded an explicit film £85,000. Can the First Minister clarify Creative Scotland's prioritisation process in cultural funding decisions, and what steps the Scottish Government are taking to safeguard the diversity and vibrancy of Glasgow's cultural landscape?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I Write is a fantastic festival. Anybody that has had the pleasure of being able to attend its events in the past knows the value that it brings, not just to the city, but indeed, I would suggest, to the country as a whole. Of course, Annie Wells will be aware that these decisions are for Creative Scotland to make, and they make them independently of Scottish Government ministers. Nonetheless, of course, having been alerted to the news, I will look at what potential support Scottish Government can provide, because Annie Wells is right. I Write is a fantastic festival, and I would say it's something of a cultural icon, an institution within our festival and cultural landscape. So I will examine the issue and, of course, be happy to keep the member updated.
Well, the First Minister will have to get a move on, because the I Write Festival last year took place in the end of May. Now, let's go back to Jeanette and the first of her interviews on the voluntary sector.
Hi folks, I am Jeanette Hill, and I'm talking today to Peter, who's going to talk about his volunteering experience. Hi Peter.
Hi Jeanette.
Good to talk to you. Before we go into the volunteering, do you want to say a little bit about you?
Yes, sure, no problem at all. I started off as a volunteer, and I had a 35-year career in the caring professions, and about 8 years when I worked for a local authority, sort of a real poacher turned gamekeeper. I worked extensively in the voluntary sector, mostly in the addictions and homelessness fields, and I've seen colossal changes, and very few for the better in that time.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by huge changes that you... What particular... Do you mean structural changes, like changing from public to private provision, that kind of thing? Is that what you mean?
Certainly part of it is that, and I think for me the biggest one was the change in working conditions in the voluntary sector. Right. When I started in 1992, Jeanette, I was earning $13,500 a year. Yeah. Nowadays, they're looking to employ people at the minimum wages from there. And I think the other huge change was the shift in local authorities from commissioning services to tendering. Yeah. And I know it sounds as if they're the same, but commissioning would mean an authority would get all the partners, voluntary, private, whoever, and work out what the gaps were in an area, and then create services to meet the gaps. And as well as that, there was a tendency to allow people to try things for 2 or 3 years and see how it went. And then it moved to tendering, and I don't care what they say about how they work it out, because I worked in commissioning, it's all about values, not it's all about costs. Yeah. And now what you're seeing is homeless hostels at night having security guards in. Yeah. And I think you and I both know through growing up that sometimes nights can be the time when you're at your lowest and you need support.
Yeah, not untrained security guards, if you like. You need to get out. Yeah.
From there. Absolutely from there. And I think nowadays the biggest, when they're saying tendering about costs, the thing that people can influence the most is wages. Yeah. And it goes from there. So these are the huge changes. Although an awful lot of voluntary sectors still look after their employers very well. My last job was working for a national company in Glasgow, and during lockdown, they looked after us so well. You know, I can honestly get emotional thinking how well that company looked after us. For us, a council will come in and then say, well, I see you've got a staff room there. Can you not put another bedroom in? And everything's been eroded. If there is a good thing that's been happening, I think the big thing is there's much more of a tendency now to believe in recovery. that people can get better when supported appropriately, and also in listening to the voices of lived experience, which in the old days maybe didn't happen so much as there. But when a country gives most of its money away to another country who gives you some back, there's bound to be deficits.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one, yeah. Peter, yeah, absolutely, yeah, I agree to that one. And obviously, another country, well, sort of Westminster, the government in Westminster right now are not as social contract orientated, I would say, as we are hopefully in Scotland, or indeed we could be in Scotland, I think, and the constant depletion of council budgets means that they are constantly looking for how do they cut money from different things. And you're saying that seriously affects the services that voluntary services can provide. Although there's the good side of the voluntary services, I agree with you, like they may well be led by the people who need the service, who use the service, the users, yeah, which is great, or certainly influenced by them. All that stuff is good. I'm with you, Peter. That was really an interesting and thoughtful point of view that you've said. You yourself, what did you think you got out of being a volunteer?
Well, as I said, I was a volunteer at first. I was paid member of staff after that. But as a volunteer, I moved to Edinburgh from the Highlands. I didn't know what was happening or where I was going. And I thought, well, I'll try and build up some skills in a different trade. And I started volunteering in a homeless agency in Edinburgh who started sending me in college courses, moving me on, etc. And after a period, there's a huge, huge gulf, and even still, between volunteering and being a paid worker. And that gave me the chance to get in, and I got sessional work, and I moved in. And it also made me feel very strongly I was contributing and giving back to my country and to my people from there. And the benefits of that for myself in terms of, at the time, my own esteem and my own ability to look into a more positive future was extremely positive for me. And well, I had 34 years or so working in it from that start. But you need people to have the time to devote to volunteering, to work with volunteers and make sure it's not just a case of handing out soup from a high counter, but the volunteers are also being trained. And there's a very positive development in homelessness called Housing First, where they found for the people who were stuck at the bottom that they were falling back. And by looking at Housing First and looking at psychologically informed environments helps the staff develop and train as well as the clients. And that needs to be a crucial part, how we supervise and train and the volunteers become the next workers.
That's a brilliant point. That's it. It's about developing our skill base for our entire population. Yeah, that is what you're saying. Absolutely. I mean, some sort of system of support so that kids who haven't got the money, or young people who haven't got the money to volunteer, so that it's not just us older people who have retired who are able to do it, so that the young people can do it as well. I totally support that. I agree with you. That was a great point that you just made there, Peter. Thank you very much for that.
Another thing as well is we've become city-centric.
Yes.
And just when we say, it works in Shawlands, therefore it will work in Achilty-Booey. And we need to look at, if we're using people in the voluntary sector and in volunteering in more rural areas, do you know what? Sometimes I think, Jeanette, we need to look back and see what people did to look after their own communities before professionalisation.
Definitely. Let's look back and let's, as you say, get the people who are on the ground, who are doing the jobs, who've always done it. Let's see what they need and what they want from the services to make it happen for them. Definitely a great point, and really good point about just imposing city-based ideas onto rural communities, rural and island communities, absolutely. And on that point, maybe you'll come back to us, Peter, and talk to us about being a Gaelic speaker at some point. will you?
Absolutely, that would be my pleasure. And nobody's getting away without me saying that Athamara, 3 words, and tomorrow, what will we need to do? And that tends to be a battle cry with me as American. That would be an absolute pleasure to do that, Jeanette.
That would be great. And Asamara, is that right? Is that how it's said?
Athamara.
Asamara. Right, lovely. Brilliant. Put it on our Facebook page and get us all to say it.
That sounds great. I'll be looking for that.
Thanks again. Brilliant, Peter. Really great. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Jeanette. Bye-bye.
OK, I'm back to a couple of news stories now. First of all, it's a thin line between love and hate, as they say. Well, Scotland's Hate Crime Act will take legal effect from the 1st of April. That's next Monday. News for Scotland will report on its first week of operation after we see how it works. Will it lead to greater protection for minorities, or will artists and journalists self-censor in order to avoid having some sort of criminal record against their name? It's a quasi-criminal record, isn't it? Well, we'll find out. But this week, Murdo Fraser, Conservative MSP for Perthshire, announced that he is taking Police Scotland to court for unlawfully keeping records on him. Last year, Mr Fraser posted on Twitter X the following. He said, "Choosing to identify as non-binary is as valid as choosing to identify as a cat. I'm not sure governments should be spending time on action plans for either." Well, some unknown person reported that tweet to the police as a hate incident. Murdo Fraser has learned that this has been recorded as such against his name and is going to remain on police records. Murdo Fraser has taken legal advice and he believes that the police are breaking possibly 3 laws: the Data Protection Act, the UK Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. Mr Fraser said Police Scotland have behaved not just outrageously but unlawfully, according to the legal advice obtained by the Free Speech Union. So we'll report on that and anything that actually comes up under the Hate Crime Act itself, because remember, it hasn't actually become law yet, but already police are recording what they call, I think, non-crime hate incidents. People have been asking, if it's not a crime, what's it got to do with the police? OK, as I said, we'll report on that once it happens. Let's move on to the next story. The Scotland's renewable energy sector is booming. One thing Scotland doesn't lack is wind. New figures show that Scotland's capacity for generating non-polluting electricity rose by 10% last year, with most of that increase coming from wind turbines either on land or offshore. Scotland continues to generate more electricity than it needs, and net exports to the rest of the UK were worth an estimated $1.5 billion in the year 23. In 2022, Scotland had 13.9 gigawatts of renewable capacity, and this rose to 15.3 gigawatts last year. But developments in the pipeline can see this increasing to 25.9 gigawatts once the 517 current projects start producing. Now let's look again at the WASPI campaign and update. We reported last week on the sudden and poorly advertised increase of the women's retirement age from 60 to 66, which happened under the Cameron Osborne government. Alison Thewlis, MP for Glasgow, has been in touch with Jeanette and the NFS team to say that the UK Ombudsman has ruled that the affected women born in the 1950s are victims of maladministration and are owed compensation. However, the UK government and the DWP have refused to offer any compensation. Alison Thewlis is deeply frustrated that this whole process has taken so long and is also disappointed to see that Labour have reneged on previous commitments to compensate the WASPI women. The SNP, she adds, will continue to press for justice and redress for all the affected women. And if you missed it, Jeanette's story on WASPI, that's Women Against State Pension Injustice, was in our show last week. You can find that under the 22nd of March if you look for it on Spotify. Now let's go to the Scottish Parliament again. A short debate took place last week, and it was short because the original Act already became law in 2018, but needed tidying up. At least that's what the Scottish Government said. We are talking about the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, which included a new definition of a woman. Was that needed? Surely that's an adult human female. Anyway, here's Shirley Ann Somerville for the Scottish Government. tidying up.
The Gender Representation on Public Boards Amendment Scotland Bill seeks to remove the Section 2 definition of woman from the original 2018 Act. This follows decisions of the Inner House of the Court of Session, which were effective from the 19th of April 2022. The Court decided that the Section 2 definition was out with the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament and was not law, and accordingly had no legal effect. At that time, our counsel told the Court that we would remove the redundant definition from the 2018 Act. This bill, if passed, will provide clarity by removing the redundant definition from the statute book to ensure that no one is misled.
OK, at this point you might want some clarity of what was the redundant definition. In the 2018 Act, the Scottish Government said that a woman includes a person who has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and it went on to say if a person is living as a woman and is proposing to undergo, is undergoing or has undergone a process of becoming a woman. So that person, man, can be included in the category of woman. Not any longer.
I appreciate that bringing forward such a small bill is very unusual. We did look at all other planned legislation but did not find a suitable vehicle to take this forward. This bill is simply to clear up that statute book, as I say, to make sure that it is not misleading.
OK, nothing to see here, we're just tidying up.
That the bill provides a small technical fix to clear up the statute book.
And Karen Adam, MSP, was also concerned to tidy up the statute book. Here's a bit of her contribution.
Amendment Scotland Bill is a single-issue bill that provides a technical fix to tidy up the statute book following rulings of the Court of Session on the 18th of February and the 22nd of March 2022.
And as Karen Adams summed up, she reminds us this is just a technical fix.
It is a technical fix to update the statute book. OK,
so nothing to see here, we're merely tidying up. But Megan Gallagher of the Scottish Conservatives was having none of that. Here's her speech.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's Stage 1 debate will be relatively brief. The Cabinet Secretary and the convener have both said that this is a technical amendment. But the one question that many women across Scotland will have is this: how did we end up here in the first place? The Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018 set out the objective for public boards to ensure that at least half of their non-executive members were women. This included the definition of the word women to include trans women. For Women, Scotland brought a judicial review on the gender representation on this Act, and the Court of Session Inner House ruled on the 18th of February 2022 that it was out with its legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament as it amended the definitions of the protected characteristics on the Equality Act of 2010. The court session declared that incorporating some of those with the protected characteristics of gender reassignment, whether they hold a gender recognition certificate or not, into the definition of women unlawfully conflates and confuses two separate and distinct protected characteristics. An exception in the Equality Act allowing provision for women excludes biological males. The SNP government have therefore brought an amendment forward to align with this ruling. Presiding Officer, women have fought for hundreds of years to achieve equality and to ensure their rights are protected. But these rights have been eroded by our government, who is hell-bent on bringing in laws and legislation that puts women's rights at risk. I think it's clear that women's groups have had enough of laws that create a hierarchy of protected characteristics. It's divisive and it creates more division in our society. Women's groups will continue to challenge this government when they attempt to bring in legislation that will have a detrimental impact on women, their rights and safeguarding. The Scottish Conservatives will support the amendment of this bill today, however, ask that the Scottish Government begins to work with women's groups and not against them. Thank you.
And that was Megan Gallagher for the Scottish Conservatives. Speaking next, Ash Regan for Alba Party took up some of those points.
The Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice has described today's amendment as simply a small technical fix to the statute book. But I completely disagree with that analysis. This amendment bill is the Scottish Government's very public acceptance, however grudgingly given, that its policy that trans women are women has been thoroughly defeated in Scotland's highest court. Through a late change in the wording of the law, and without any equality impact assessment, the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act defined women entirely based on self-ID. This was, we were assured, a one-time only redefinition which would have no meaning outside of the Act. But as predicted by women's rights campaigners, however, this new definition was soon used as proof that self-ID was now the law in Scotland and could not be argued against. 4 Women Scotland, some of whom are in the gallery with us today, brought a judicial review on this new definition of women, and the Inner House of the Court of Session ruled on the 18th of February 2022 that it was unlawful. Today's short bill removes this definition from the face of the legislation. Whether this new definition will have to be changed again in support of 4 Women Scotland's belief, and mine, that for the purposes of the Equality Act, women should be defined entirely on the basis of biological sex. This question will now be decided at the Supreme Court. But what is already clear today is that the Scottish Government's policy that all men who identify as women should be treated as women is in fact unlawful. And in fact, self-ID has no legal standing. Trans women are not women under Scots law. And so it is wholly wrong for any organisation or MSP to still rely on a definition which has now been ruled unlawful and, as can be seen today, has been accepted as such by the Scottish Government. At the very least, the Scottish Government should make sure it does not fund organisations that are advising it incorrectly, and that all processes and policies are being updated to ensure that this does not happen again. And I would welcome a statement from the Government on that, especially as the Government is currently saying it will bring forward a bill on conversion therapy this year. And I'm also wondering, as others in the Chamber might be, when will the Scottish Government advise its own MSPs what the law is saying in this regard? This debacle, after all, was the start of a whole suite of legislation, together with the Hate Crime Bill, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, based, as far as I can see, on the demands of lobby groups the Government is funding, and it is entirely symptomatic of the failings of a Government pursuing legislation costing hundreds of thousands of pounds of public money that do not reflect the view of the public, and money that I'm sure would be much better spent elsewhere.
So the Scottish Government does not have the legal power to change what a woman is. Let's look at news from Europe. Vladimir Putin's aggression to Europe's east is making EU voters think more about defence, according to a big Euronews poll. Frontline nations like Finland are already starting to spend more on defence, with the possibility of a second Donald Trump White House committing less to Europe's defence. This could be good news for European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who's making European defence one of her top priorities as she runs for re-election in May. Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, was again attacked by Russian missiles this week. That's part of Russia's renewed aerial assault on its neighbour since Putin's one-sided election victory a couple of weeks ago. President Zelensky said he was grateful to Ukraine's emergency services following the Russian terrorist attacks using ballistic missiles aimed at Kyiv. Meanwhile, Italy has joined France and other European countries in raising its security alert level following the terrorist attacks in Moscow last week. This focus on security is in contrast to the lack of concern for its own citizens from the Russian authorities. It's been reported that the gunmen at the Moscow concert hall had over an hour to carry out their murders before the underarmed police finally arrived at the scene of destination, but by that time the terrorists had long gone, although they were later captured but 150 or maybe 190 kilometres away, according to different reports. As we're trying to cross the border into either Belarus or Ukraine, again reports differ, the Kremlin has suggested that Kyiv had some involvement in the atrocity. Kremlin spokespersons have said if they're trying to get into Ukraine, that suggests they may have came from Ukraine in the first place, but there's no evidence for that at all. The murderers were in fact reportedly from Tajikistan. The Ukrainian authorities strongly deny having anything to do with the atrocity. Meanwhile, it's reported that US intelligence agencies had already given Russia a warning of information that some sort of attack was probably being planned. And finally in Europe for this week, another Brexit benefit. Scotland's valuable salmon exports are down due to Brexit red tape. The Financial Times reports that Scotland lost $100 million a year because of being out of the lucrative EU single market. Last year, Scotland's salmon exports to Europe fell by 15%. That's down from 55,000 to 44,000 tonnes, although the cash value only fell 3% because the prices also rose at the same time. Scottish salmon is the UK's biggest food export. Spokespersons for the Scottish salmon industry said that the next UK government needs to seek agreement with Europe to ease the burden on exporters. The UK Labour Party has ruled out rejoining the world's largest trading bloc, but agreements could still be made to make sure that standards here and in the EU are the same. This sensible approach angers the Brexit wing of the ruling UK Conservative Party because the big idea of Brexit was to get away from European laws and not to follow them. Now, just before we go back to Jeanette, looking forward to next week, the News for Scotland team we're going into the studio. And if we can get the tech to work properly, we're going to put the show out as a video. We'll still be on the podcast channel, so if you pick us up on Spotify, etc., the sound will still be there. But in addition, and I don't know if this is going to help, you might be able to see us too. And not only that, but we're planning as soon as we can, maybe next week, to actually get out of the studio, or in my case, to get out of the garden shed, to interview folk, maybe you. And we're going to talk to you about the top stories of the week and see what people think. So all that is to look forward to. But back to this week, and we're going to finish with that other interview on the voluntary sector from Jeanette. Here she is.
Hello folks, so it's Jeanette Hill here for News for Scotland, and I'm going to talk to Sarah Morris, one of our listeners who very kindly has agreed to talk to us about her volunteer experience. Hello Sarah.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for coming on to talk to us. And are you currently in Dumfriesshire?
I am, yes.
Lovely. Dumfries and Galloway, I love it. It's a beautiful part of the world, beautiful part of our beautiful country. People forget and they go off up to the Highlands to see, but they forget about Dumfries and Galloway, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. It's just that bit that's in between Carlisle and Glasgow.
Yeah, that's it. It's nearer for tourists to come up from England to visit it, and so big. I can't believe when I first discovered it how big it is. Although I believe my father, so he said, was from that area. Maxwell, I suppose there must be.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, our question was, what was your experience of volunteering? And you were saying that you volunteered for, was it the Brownies?
I did, yes. I ran a pack for 5 years, maybe a bit more, give or take. Started off as a helper and developed up to a leader before finally saying enough's enough.
Yeah, it's a big commitment, isn't it? I've had friends who are primary school teachers and said what a commitment they've had to make. Well, it was Girl Guides, actually. They both were doing the Girl Guides, and they did do some fabulous work, though, with the groups. But yeah, a big commitment. It's made 5 years after that. Was great. Which community was that you were contributing to?
It was in Dumfries. It was Lockerbriggs First, it was called.
Yeah.
So it was ran at the community centre nearby.
And what was your experience of it then?
To begin with, it was fantastic. I used to enjoy going, helping organise things, running, making sure the finances ran smoothly. As time wore on, it went from being less about the children, more about the education.
Yeah.
And that wasn't what we were there for. We were there for giving them downtime after being at school all day.
Yeah. Fun. So you're saying that the sort of Brownie movement were imposing a kind of curriculum on you, really?
Yes. Yes, it came from on high.
Was that from them, or do you think that was from the sort of Scottish government? You know, the sort of every child matters kind of thing. That's what they say in England. Was it that? Was it that idea?
That I don't know. All I know is when it was the AGM, we were told to go more onto the curriculum to follow it that way. So I don't know where it came from.
It's a lot to ask, isn't it, of volunteers who are not necessarily trained as teachers or anything like that. It's a lot to ask of them, and who are given their time for free, you know, and they have to do all this extra time for the planning, etc. You already have a lot of extra time, don't you, in the Girl Guides and the Brownies, because you've got to do a lot of admin, which is about safety. Yes.
Yeah. And then you've got to do your training as well. So I did my leadership training through them as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're looking at safety in terms of, obviously, all adults being checked, PVG'd.
before they work with the children, but also you're looking at safety in terms of bullying or any kind of, when you take children out on any kind of trip, there's such a lot of risk assessments and stuff like that you've got to do before you take children anywhere. Yeah, it makes it a daunting prospect for volunteers. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you know, are the Brownie and Guide movement, are they having trouble getting volunteers maybe because of all these restrictions?
I
don't
believe
know.
so, because when I last heard, there was a waiting list for getting into guides because there wasn't enough guiders. So it is putting a lot of people off having that there.
Yeah, a lot of pressure on people. I'd imagine it would. And yet, I mean, thinking about my own childhood, my siblings' childhoods, without the sort of, like, for them it was Boy Scouts and I think, what was the other one? Boys Brigade. And for me it was certainly Girl Guides. And the things I experienced, which I never experienced anywhere else, camping, a whole range of different stuff that we experienced, bonfires, a whole range of things that we just would never have got that experience if it hadn't been for the fabulous people running the Brownies and the Guides and the Scouts, the Cubs and the other organisations. And when we are, especially in poorer areas, in Glasgow, we are so short of youth and community opportunities for the children. It would be such a shame to see the Brownies and Guides going as well, wouldn't it? Really?
It would, because it's a part of our cultural heritage.
Absolutely.
Not just Scotland, but UK wide.
Yeah, absolutely is. Yeah, it is. And as we say, gives so much to the children. It's almost like forest schools, isn't it? Really, it's getting out there and doing all sorts of stuff in the learning about your environment, our wonderful natural environment that we have in Scotland,
and learning household skills as well.
Yeah, learning those. Absolutely. I think that is where I actually learned to knit, and certainly, sort of crochet. I do remember that, and I can still remember how to do it now because the woman who taught us was so patient. And we did baking. We did all sorts of stuff that schools nowadays don't really have the facilities or the time to do. Or they do a bit of it. They don't have the time, and it's great to do it in a play environment.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying, rather than a school environment where children often feel pressured for different reasons. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And it's about being inclusive as well. So having that education there, you're taking the inclusivity away.
Yes, saying anybody can do it. Yeah, that's it. Anybody can do it. It doesn't matter what you can do. It's whatever you can do.
Sorry about the washing machine there.
Say it again.
Sorry about the washing machine there.
Oh, don't worry, I can't hear it. That's always the same. It's always the same for all of us, domestic. Usually it's my doorbell going, but don't worry about it at all. I can't even hear it. Which part of Dumfriesshire are you in?
I'm actually in Dumfries itself.
Oh, you're in Dumfries itself. Oh, great. Good. I know they worry about the floods, aren't they? They're worried about the River Neath bursting its banks again.
Yeah, that's just normality.
Indeed, that's for another programme for Sarah, for you to come on and talk about that, about flood defences, etc. in Dumfries and why they need them. But that's been great. Thank you very much. And I definitely agree that is a big contribution, that the Guides, the Brownies, the Scouts contribute so much to our children and to our communities. And it would be a shame to lose out because we're pressurising the folk that are doing it for free, giving their time for free, it'd be a shame to lose out on that for the children. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for doing it.
You're very welcome.
And thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you too.
And that's it for this weekend of March. So thank you for listening. Whether you are in the United States or in Germany, we have people listening in France this week, a couple in Brazil too. Obrigado. Also noticed a couple of weeks ago we've got more people in England listening than we have in Scotland, although this week it's balanced up a bit. But wherever you are, thanks for listening to our news where we are. We will be back next week in audio and hopefully in video too. I'm Hugh Stewart. Thanks for listening and we'll see you later.